I should also just start by thanking Peter. Where is Peter? But oh yeah, great. It's fantastic to be here in Ghent, and I was here last year on holiday, so glad to be back. And to particularly thank the Polish team and Axel in particular for a lot of the work here. Axel did a lot of the heavy lifting, as you all know, and so I'm just a bit of a mouthpiece for all of us. Okay, so is this going to work here? Yeah. So there'll be a few slides on here that you're quite familiar with, but because this is being recorded for an online audience, we felt we'd better explain a few things as we go along. So as you all know, we had 18 case studies for this, really develop this place-based learning on how to undergo restoration. And these were in the 3 clusters. Now I'm going to go ahead because I think, yeah. As I said, there were in 3 clusters here, focusing on different environments really and different scales. So we had the peatlands and wetlands, the small streams and basins, and the large transboundary rivers. And many of us involved in Work Package 1 sort of took ownership, or at least we belong to one of these 3 families. So I'm particularly familiar with small streams and basins. I think Tomasz was large transboundary rivers, and Axel was the peatlands and wetlands. So I have my small community within MERLIN who I know really well. All the restoration measures were focused on nature-based solutions, and as we all know now, what nature-based solutions mean is we're not only trying to restore biodiversity, but nature-based solutions are solutions for some societal challenge that we're trying to address, often related to climate resilience or climate adaptation, so the climate change challenge, but also other challenges, so water purification, even green growth, some of these other Green Deal challenges that are affecting society. And so that's why these societal challenges and societal transformation was very much a part of MERLIN. So it wasn't just your standard biodiversity restoration project. It was really about societal transformation as part of that and achieving these societal goals as well as biodiversity goals. Okay, I think I'm going to hand over to you now, Seb, for the next few slides. Yeah. But yeah.
So we were thinking that at the beginning of all, to understand what evidence shall we collect and do we need to collect to show that restoration is really impacting on the ground. We wanted to understand what are you anticipating? Where do you want to go in your case? And for this, we conducted a theory of change analysis, co-conducted, co-designed it with you, with all the 18 cases in a very standardized way. And well, information about this, and you will see that throughout the talks, this is information for you to learn about in the MERLIN Academy. And well, probably many of you remember that we have framed or asked you what is the problem that you'd like to address with your case and with your activities intervention on the ground. And on the other hand, what are the goals you are expecting to achieve? And in between, what are the measures to tackle these problems, these challenges on the ground? So these challenges also framed as triggers for action. And then to make it more explicit, you described as what you expect to achieve in the short, medium and long run when you implement these measures. And from this, we were able to produce 18 different theories of change with all the arrows and cause effect chains that you provided us with, ultimately to achieve the goals that you wanted to deliver in the long run. And just to provide us with an overview about the different challenges that you identified. So more than half of the challenges you identified were in the realm of environmental degradation and biodiversity loss. Well, no wonder, this is where we come from. But the other half is all over the place. So understanding that we are here not only tackling the biodiversity issues and the environmental issues, but very much also issues ranging from climate resilience to water management, social justice and social cohesion, new economic opportunities, and so on. So this is really tackling a broad array of issues. And when you then looked into the measures that you have deployed within MERLIN, but also in the demonstration cases, so in the time before MERLIN, you see that many of these are to be put into the category of nature-based solutions and ecosystem-based approaches, but there were also other kinds of measures, more softer measures, not the ones where you need the digger in the field. So it is a very broad array, and it demonstrates that your cases are very much tackling societal issues and ecological issues together. Looking at the spectrum of goals that you identify to be achieved when deploying these measures on the ground, and this is sorted by, okay, this is the primary goal that you have identified, and then you see the other bars showing the secondary goals and the co-benefits. It's the biodiversity net gain, but it's also all the other Green Deal goals that you have had in mind, which were identified by the theory of change. And against this background, this is again an example, looking onto the goals. And now we come back to what kind of indicators did you pursue? What kind of Green Deal criteria are you looking for? And then thinking about how can we bring in the MERLIN indicator framework? And this is where I leave it back to you, Laurence.
Okay, thanks very much, Seb. Yeah, I think when we all started this, we had this idea of, oh, we'll have all these indicators for all these different elements of the Green Deal. And it's only when you really start doing it in reality, you realize, okay, this is a bit of a challenge. But we had a lot of help from people in different disciplines to try and get together with some really practical indicators that were really policy relevant as well. And this whole monitoring and evaluation framework, it's such a fundamental for restoration projects because we need the evidence to underpin, are we going in the right trajectory? We might not have got the goal yet, but are we going at least in that right trajectory? Are we causing any conflicts or synergies with sectors and social inclusion and things? So there's so much more that successful restoration is about, that we need to have measures of the trajectory for all these elements of integrated sort of restoration. So we start with our familiar territory here, the environmental criteria, and it was important to have indicators related to the biodiversity strategy, the Habitats Directive, Nature Restoration Regulation came in, and also some of these climate policy goals in terms of climate regulation, so greenhouse gas emissions, and climate resilience, so water storage capacity. So it's pretty fundamental indicators for many of the case studies. Social criteria was something we hadn't really worked with a lot in the past. And so we had to think about, what's important for successful restoration and how can you have impact? So bringing society and communities into the restoration process so they, in a way, take ownership of it. And that's why we made such a big effort to think about climbing that stakeholder ladder of engagement and analysing your stakeholder involvement throughout the project. I think health and well-being was a much more challenging one for us in this project. It really, to do it properly, it requires a lot of work and a lot of long-term studies to really link cause and effect. So often we're thinking about proxies that we think will lead to health and welfare benefits, health and well-being benefits. And then we've got economic criteria here. Again, something I think should be measured much more frequently, and that's why we think it's really important that we measure green growth and the financing behind your restoration, but also importantly, what are the synergies or trade-offs with the economic sectors? Because it's really important when we are putting in these restoration measures, and we need to be transparent about the implications it means for these key sectors: agriculture, energy production, transport. So, you know, without that, these sectors may need compensation for conflicts with agricultural production, for example. Ideally, we were looking for pre and post restoration monitoring, but also control versus impact sites. And that was a challenge that we didn't really meet. Only, I think, a couple of case studies were able to put monitoring into control sites as well as impact sites. So it was mainly pre and post restoration monitoring. And for many sites, actually, the post restoration monitoring came a little bit. Some of it came after the final reporting. But I know that many of you have been continuing your monitoring and do have more post-restoration monitoring now. So this is just a nice plot that I think Axel produced, looking at the reported data sets. And you can really see here the amount of data reported on biodiversity net gain was by far the largest amount, and on some of these other environmental criteria here. But impressively, there were also very good reporting for some of the, I mean, because this scale is so huge because of the biodiversity one, there are still quite a lot of data for some of the other elements that were reported. And I think everyone managed to report on these core set of indicators as well, which was great. So you know, we did have a lot of data in the end to discuss in our synthesis. And Daniel, I think, showed this a little bit earlier, but some of the results of the systemic monitoring, you have to read the deliverable to see the detail of this. But the main, I think the key thing that we found is that there were many positive benefits across these three different criteria. I would sort of caution that with a bit of some of our, you know, economic criteria were quite limited to short-term goals. So, you know, has the restoration implementation led to some job creation in the area? But to look at that long-term would be great, but we just didn't have the sort of timelines within the project to look at some of these indicators in a more longer-term perspective. And we also looked and got assessments on the confidence in your data as well, and generally it was a fairly sort of confident picture on the results as well. There was high confidence in the results. So generally, but it's clear to see there were some negative impacts, but they were pretty minor. And even the agricultural productivity one, we saw that when there were impacts on agricultural land, they were relatively minor in proportion, in percentage terms. The teaser, you can see, there's a really nice detailed case study of the teaser in the deliverable, and it's in the policy brief, but it really does, we use that to illustrate the connectivity between all these different indicators, and where where there's negativities and where positivities. So I think that's a really nice case study to explore how you bring all that your monitoring and evaluation together into a sort of more integrated picture of the success of restoration. And just more recently, they've been looking at what you're planning to continue in terms of monitoring, and it's good to see that many of the indicators are continuing, and we'll look into why many of them also are not continuing. after MERLIN. So yeah, the discontinuation is largely driven by resource constraints and not necessarily technical barriers. So again, financing to continue your monitoring and evaluation work. But it's also, I think this is an important thing, that the indicator set that we had was actually quite extensive and didn't really always map across your case study goals in any way. They seem to be relatively of minor importance or not necessarily relevant to those. So that's important to say as well. So yeah, the challenges are sustaining such sort of comprehensive systemic monitoring frameworks in the longer term. I think balancing the need to have a standard set of indicators versus maybe a set of indicators that are more locally derived and context specific, that are agreed with communities. You know, those two things don't always go together. Thinking about actually attributing some of the benefits we see to the measures is actually pretty tricky, even just especially with a before-after approach. But we did see with many of the narratives that many of the benefits are not necessarily quantitative or monetary, and that certainly does affect some of the cost-benefit analysis that we did in work package 3, I think it was, yeah. So I'm going to just quickly go through because I think so some of the solutions, we think many of the indicators were relatively straightforward, not too resource heavy and practical. And so that's why we hope many can continue. We have explored in the project the use of citizen science. I think we can develop that much more for some of the biodiversity and water quality monitoring and even some of the ecosystem service monitoring. Citizen science is really not used much for looking at how people interact with the environment, how they use the environment. And I think there's a great scope there to look at that much more broadly. I think we had a core set of indicators, and I think it's important that we also complement that with local context-specific indicators. For biodiversity, we focused on habitats directive, priority habitats and species. In regional context, there might be much more important national or local biodiversity species or habitats that you want to focus on. I said a bit about control impact, and narratives are, I think, really important. They enrich the story. And if you look at some of the stories that we'll hear about later on today, it's the narratives that really give you, add interest and add societal need into the story. So finally, so I think it's clear that even though our post-restoration monitoring was quite short, it does show some positive impacts of MBS, some limited trade-offs with land use. I think the systemic monitoring is something we need to push for more. We do need to collect the impacts on the economy, on jobs and finances and on sectors when we are monitoring, and on participation. It does require long-term funding, long-term community support, governance support. But as I said, the narratives also, you can get enriched by narratives from communities as well. I think that's us, Seb, yeah? Oh, there's one last slide to thank you all for actually being so much part of this, because this was really all 18 demo sites really contributed, and this couldn't have happened without all your amazing efforts over the 4.5 years. So thank you all.